It was a bright sunny morning, and the wedding day had finally arrived. Emily, the bride, was both excited and nervous as she stood in front of the mirror, carefully adjusting her wedding dress. Her heart raced with anticipation, but there was also a tinge of worry. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but there was one thing that made her uneasy: her father, John. John was an elderly man, kind-hearted and full of wisdom, but his age had started to show. His once strong steps had slowed, and his hands trembled slightly when he held something. He had been a devoted father, always doing everything in his power to provide for Emily and ensure she had a good life. But now his body was no longer what it used to be, and Emily feared that the groom's family would look down on him. The groom, Mark, was a wonderful man, but his family was a different story. Emily knew her father's age would be a topic of quiet conversation at the wedding. In particular, Mark's mother, Karen, had made several offhand comments about John's appearance in the weeks leading up to the wedding. She had spoken about how frail he looked and how he might not be able to keep up with the younger crowd. Emily had brushed it off at first, but deep down, it hurt. Her father had always done his best to be there for her, and to have others criticize him because of his age made her feel uncomfortable. Emily stood there in her room, her hands trembling slightly as she finished putting on her earrings. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking a deep breath. Today she was marrying the man she loved, but there was a heavy weight on her heart. She didn't want to let anyone spoil her happiness, but the thought of her father being treated with anything less than kindness made her stomach turn. The wedding venue was beautiful, with flowers hanging from every corner and the soft melody of a string quartet playing in the background. Guests arrived, mingling and chatting excitedly about the ceremony. Emily's heart swelled as she saw her friends and family gathered in one place, but she couldn't shake the thought of her father's discomfort. John had been in the background of the planning process, quietly making sure everything was perfect. He wasn't one to ask for attention, but Emily knew that sometimes people treated him as if he were invisible. As the ceremony began, Emily walked down the aisle with her father by her side. John's grip on her arm was firm, though she could feel this slight tremble. Emily looked up at him and smiled, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. John smiled back, his face filled with pride for his daughter. But as they approached the altar, Emily caught sight of Karen's disapproving gaze. She couldn't help but feel a pang of anger. Karen's eyes lingered on her father, her expression one of judgment. Emily did her best to focus on the vows she was about to make to Mark, but the discomfort from the groom's family was hard to ignore. She could hear Karen whispering to her husband Gerald, her voice just loud enough for Emily to catch snippets. "I didn't realize the bride's father was so frail," she heard Karen say. "I wonder if he'll be able to stand during the whole ceremony." Gerald chuckled in response, and Emily felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. It was clear that the groom's family had no intention of hiding their opinions about her father. Emily's heart sank, and she squeezed John's arm gently, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension in the air. John, being the quiet and dignified man he was, kept his head held high, never once showing how hurtful the remarks were. Emily's thoughts raced as she tried to block out the judgment surrounding her. She had worked so hard to ensure this day was perfect for everyone, but it felt like her father was being treated as an afterthought. She felt guilty for even thinking about it during the ceremony. This was her wedding day, and she didn't want anything to ruin it. But deep down, Emily knew that the unkind remarks from Karen and Gerald were impossible to ignore. With each step she took down the aisle, Emily's smile became more forced. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her father instead of celebrating her love for Mark. She could only hope that once the ceremony was over, things would calm down, and her father would be treated with the respect he deserved. But as she took Mark's hand at the altar, she made a vow to herself. No matter what happened, she would make sure her father knew just how much she loved him. The ceremony continued, and as Emily stood beside Mark, her heart still felt heavy. The vows had been exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers, and everyone stood to cheer as they were announced husband and wife. But the weight of the groom's family's behavior lingered in Emily's mind. The guests filed into the reception hall, with its gleaming tables and elegant decorations, yet there was an undercurrent of tension that Emily couldn't shake. As the bride and groom entered the reception, everyone rose to their feet and clapped, their faces full of smiles and warm congratulations. Yet, Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle glances exchanged between the groom's parents, Karen and Gerald. She saw how they eyed her father, John, who had taken a seat near the back of the room, content to watch the celebration quietly. The older man's tired eyes and slow movements made him seem like he didn't belong with the younger, more vibrant crowd. Emily had never seen her father as anything less than strong and proud, but she feared that others couldn't see him the same way. The reception carried on with toasts, dances, and laughter, but every now and then, Emily could catch snippets of Karen's voice from across the room. She could see her shaking her head in disbelief, undoubtedly making disparaging comments about John under her breath. It was all too clear that she disapproved of his presence there. "I didn't expect such an elderly man to be so involved," Emily overheard Karen say to a friend. "I'm surprised he's even able to keep up with the event." Emily's stomach turned. How could Karen say something like that about her father, the man who had raised her, supported her, and done everything he could to give her a good life? Emily knew her father wasn't young anymore, but his heart and his love for her had only grown stronger over the years. He had dedicated his life to being the best father he could be, and now, on her wedding day, he was being mocked behind his back. She felt a hot rush of anger fill her chest. The day was meant to be about love, about family, about new beginnings, but instead, it felt like Emily was fighting an invisible battle to protect her father's dignity. Trying to shake off the negativity, Emily pushed herself to smile, turning her attention back to Mark. He stood by her side, beaming with pride, though she could see a hint of concern in his eyes. He knew something was off, but he didn't know what to say. He could only watch as Emily's usual light-hearted demeanor shifted, the joy of the day slowly being replaced by a growing unease. She tried to be strong, but the constant whispers from Karen and Gerald were impossible to ignore. John, ever the gentleman, tried to remain invisible, letting Emily and Mark enjoy the spotlight. But Emily could tell that his heart was heavy as well. John had been through so much in his life, and despite his age, he still carried himself with grace and pride. The truth was, Emily had always admired his strength, even more so now. The way he could quietly endure judgment without showing any sign of frustration or anger was something she could never fully understand. As the evening wore on, Emily tried to focus on the happy moments, the first dance with Mark, the laughter shared with friends, the speeches from those closest to her, but her mind kept drifting back to the way Karen and Gerald were acting. It hurt her to see them treat her father like he didn't matter, as if he were some fragile relic from the past instead of the wise, loving man who had given her everything. At that moment, Emily made a silent vow. She would not let this continue. She would not let her father be disrespected any longer. This was her day, yes, but it was also a day to honor the people who had shaped her into who she was. And that meant standing up for John, no matter what it took. As the reception continued, the atmosphere became more lively, but Emily could still feel the weight of the tension. People danced, ate, and mingled, but her attention kept drifting back to her father, John, sitting quietly at the back of the room. He had made sure to stay out of the way, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But Emily knew he wasn't comfortable. He had spent most of his life being the rock of their family. And now, at his daughter's wedding, he was being treated as though he didn't belong. Karen and Gerald, the groom's parents, were still making their rounds among the guests. Emily couldn't help but notice how they kept throwing sideways glances at John. Every time she looked over, they would exchange a look or make a quiet remark. She knew the whispers weren't kind. Emily tried to ignore it, but it was impossible not to overhear some of what was being said. "He really shouldn't be here," Karen muttered to another guest. "He's not exactly part of our world. I can't believe he's even standing for so long." Every remark stung, but Emily kept her focus on enjoying her day, determined not to let her father's mistreatment ruin the moment. She noticed how John still tried his best to smile at the guests and stay involved in the conversation, though he was clearly growing tired. He had never been one to complain, and he was trying his best to fit in, but it was obvious to Emily that he felt like an outsider in his own daughter's wedding. She wanted to be able to protect him, to shield him from all the hurtful comments that were being made, but it was difficult when the insults were being thrown in whispers, just out of reach. The meal was served, and as Emily looked around the room, she saw the groom's family sitting comfortably at their table, laughing and enjoying their food. Karen and Gerald continued to talk about things that didn't seem to matter, and each time Emily passed their table, she could catch another comment about her father. "I don't think he even knows how to hold himself in a crowd," Gerald said, his voice low enough that Emily wasn't sure whether he meant to be heard or not. It was almost like they were trying to make her father invisible, as if his presence didn't matter. Emily could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was her wedding day, and despite everything, she was determined to keep it together. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about one day. It was about standing up for the people who loved her, who had been there through everything, no matter what others thought. John noticed the way Emily was reacting, and he gave her a soft, reassuring smile. His eyes were filled with wisdom and love, even though she could tell that he was exhausted by the whole ordeal. Despite the hurtful things being said about him, he never once let his feelings show. He had been through so much in his life, and Emily knew he had always taught her to rise above the noise and focus on what truly mattered: love, respect, and family. But as much as she tried to follow his example, she couldn't just stand by and let him be treated like this. The evening went on, but Emily's heart remained heavy. The joy of the day was still there, but it felt clouded by the actions of the groom's parents. She couldn't understand why they treated her father this way. What had he ever done to deserve their scorn? She couldn't let it go. Emily knew she had to do something. She couldn't let the disrespect continue. Her father, John, deserved better. He had always given his best for her and the family. Now it was her turn to return that kindness, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. As the night unfolded, Emily tried to put on a brave face, but she could feel the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The joy of the wedding was beginning to feel overshadowed by the lingering discomfort created by Karen and Gerald's behavior. She had always hoped that everyone would come together and celebrate this new chapter in her life, but now it felt like her father was being unfairly judged. Every glance from Karen, every whisper between Gerald and the other guests, felt like another insult thrown his way. The speeches started, and people stood up one by one to offer their congratulations and share stories of Emily and Mark's relationship. The room was filled with heartfelt laughter and warm words, but Emily's attention wavered. She watched her father carefully, noting how he tried to keep his focus on the happiness of the day, despite the way he had been treated. John had never been one to complain, and he wore a quiet, dignified expression, never once letting on how much he was hurt by the way others were behaving. Finally, it was time for Emily and Mark to give their speech. Mark stood by her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, as they thanked everyone for being part of their special day. He spoke about their love, their journey, and how grateful they were for the support of their families. Emily smiled at him, feeling a wave of love for her new husband. But there was still something missing. Her father's quiet sacrifice was going unnoticed. As the applause settled, Emily's heart raced. She turned to John, who was seated at a table near the back, his eyes tired but still filled with warmth. She had been thinking about this moment all day, but now, standing there, she knew that she needed to act. She couldn't let her father's presence be ignored any longer. This was his day too. He had spent so many years putting others before himself, making sure Emily had everything she needed. And now, when he deserved a moment of appreciation, he was being dismissed. John had always taught her that love and respect were earned, not demanded. But this time, Emily knew that what her father needed wasn't silence or invisibility. It was recognition, and she was ready to give it to him. With a deep breath, Emily excused herself from the podium and walked over to where John sat. The guests were still talking, sipping their drinks, and enjoying the evening, unaware of what was about to happen. As Emily reached her father's side, she placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but steady. "Dad," she said, her eyes locking with his, "there's something I need to do." John looked up at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected this, but he smiled gently, always the quiet supporter. Emily could see the pride in his eyes, but she knew deep down he was just as overwhelmed by the situation as she was. She took a step back, turning to face the guests. "Everyone," she began, her voice strong, "this man here is my hero. He's been there for me through every step of my life, always guiding me with kindness, wisdom, and love. Today is about him as much as it is about me." A hush fell over the room as Emily spoke, her words cutting through the murmur of conversation. The guests fell silent, some glancing at each other, others unsure of what to expect. But Emily stood tall, her eyes never leaving her father's. "My father, John, is the reason I am who I am today. He raised me, loved me, and made countless sacrifices, even when no one was watching. So today, I want to honor him in a way that speaks louder than words." At that moment, Emily reached for a carefully wrapped box that had been sitting on the nearby table, a gift she had been waiting to give her father. She handed it to him, and as he slowly unwrapped it, the room watched in silence. Inside the box was a vintage necklace, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. It was delicate and beautiful, with intricate details that shimmered in the soft light of the reception hall. "This necklace belonged to my great-grandmother," Emily explained, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "She was a woman who loved fiercely and sacrificed much, just like you, Dad. It's been passed down to the strongest woman in each generation, and today I'm giving it to you, because you are the strongest person I know." John looked down at the necklace, his eyes misty with emotion. He was speechless, overwhelmed by the gesture. The guests, who had once been caught in their own thoughts and judgments, now looked on in awe. Emily's words had pierced through the tension, reminding everyone in the room of the true meaning of family, love, respect, and the bond that holds us together. As Emily stepped back, she watched her father's hands gently touch the necklace. It was a small, intimate gesture, but it held so much meaning. The applause around her slowly faded, but Emily didn't hear it. All she could focus on was the way her father looked at the heirloom, the way his eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause, and it was just the two of them, father and daughter, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. John had always been a man of few words, someone who didn't seek the spotlight or expect grand gestures. He had lived his life humbly, always giving and sacrificing without expecting anything in return. That was the reason Emily had always admired him. She had never felt the need to prove her love for him with extravagant gifts or public displays. But today, standing in front of their friends and family, Emily realized how important it was for her to show him just how much he meant to her, not just in private, but in front of everyone who had gathered to celebrate her wedding. John looked up at her, his lips trembling with emotion, but he didn't say anything. There was no need for words. His smile was enough. Emily's heart swelled with love for the man who had been her rock, her constant support throughout her life. The necklace wasn't just a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything he had done for her. It was a way of telling him that she saw him, that she appreciated all of his sacrifices, and that he was the most important person in her life. The room, which had been filled with a tense, almost uncomfortable silence before, was now filled with an undeniable warmth. Guests who had been whispering and casting sideways glances at John were now watching the scene with a different understanding. They saw Emily's love for her father, and in turn, they saw him for who he truly was, Not just an elderly man struggling with his age, but a father who had given everything to raise his daughter. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The judgment that had once clouded the air seemed to evaporate, replaced by a deeper respect for the man who had quietly endured so much. Karen and Gerald, who had been sitting at their table, seemed to have lost their words. The smug expressions that had once been on their faces were now replaced with something different. Embarrassment, maybe even guilt. It was clear that Emily's heartfelt gesture had affected them more than they cared to admit. They had come into the day with their preconceived notions about John. And now, with a simple act of love and respect, Emily had completely shifted their perspective. The rest of the evening unfolded more smoothly. People resumed their conversations, the mood lightened, and the festivities continued, but the earlier tension seemed to have lifted. Guests came to Emily and Mark, congratulating them on their wedding and sharing their appreciation for the beautiful moment between father and daughter. Even those who had initially felt uncomfortable now understood the depth of the bond Emily and John shared. As the night wore on, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Her heart felt lighter than it had all day. The moment with her father had not only strengthened their bond, but had also opened the eyes of everyone around them. She knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just in her life with Mark, but in her relationship with her family. John, now with the necklace resting proudly around his neck, was still sitting at the back of the room, quietly enjoying the rest of the evening. But there was a new light in his eyes. For the first time that day, he looked at peace, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. Emily made her way over to him, taking his hand gently and sitting beside him. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. John smiled and squeezed her hand, his voice soft but steady. "I love you too, Emily, more than you'll ever know." For Emily, the wedding day had been a turning point. It had begun with uncertainty and discomfort, but it ended with a deeper connection to her father and a renewed sense of understanding. The love they shared had always been strong, but now it felt even stronger. And that was the greatest gift of all. The evening continued with a sense of calm settling over the room, but the air was still thick with the emotions that had unfolded earlier. Emily couldn't help but keep stealing glances at her father, who now seemed more relaxed than before. The necklace, once just a family heirloom, had become a symbol of something greater, a reminder that love and respect weren't always given easily, but were earned through the quiet strength and grace of a person's actions. Her father had always been a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any grand speeches ever could. Mark stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her back, offering quiet support as they moved through the crowd. Guests approached them, congratulating the couple and complimenting the wedding, but many also turned their attention to John, who sat quietly at the back, his eyes twinkling with the faintest hint of joy. Emily noticed how several of the guests who had once exchanged uncomfortable glances were now coming over to talk to him, greeting him with newfound respect. She could see the change in their expressions as they offered their congratulations and spoke of how they admired the bond between father and daughter. But the most significant change of all came from Karen and Gerald. Emily hadn't expected much from them after the earlier events, but as the night went on, something shifted. They began to look at John differently, with less judgment and more understanding. It wasn't immediate, but it was clear. Karen, who had been so quick to criticize John earlier, finally approached him. "John," Karen said, her voice softer than before, "I wanted to apologize for my earlier comments. I realize now that I was wrong. I didn't know your story, and I didn't understand the kind of person you are. You've raised a wonderful daughter, and I respect that." John looked up at Karen, and for a brief moment, there was a silence between them. Emily could see how John was considering her words, his usual calm demeanor never faltering. After a beat, he smiled and nodded. "There's no need for an apology," John said quietly, his voice warm but firm. "We all make assumptions sometimes, but we learn from them. What matters is how we move forward." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. He didn't need to dwell on past mistakes. He believed in growth, in moving on, and he wasn't interested in holding grudges. Karen's face softened, and she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Gerald, who had been standing beside her, added his own apology. "I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable," he admitted. "It was wrong of us to judge you like that. I can see now how much your daughter means to you, and how much you've done for her. That deserves respect." Emily was taken aback by their sincerity. She had always hoped that her father would be treated with the respect he deserved, but she had never imagined that it would come in this way. There was something beautiful in seeing how her father's simple act of love and kindness had changed the hearts of those who had judged him. As the night went on, Emily felt her heart swell with pride. Her father had always been a man of quiet dignity, and now everyone could see that. He wasn't just the frail old man they had once seen. He was a father, a mentor, a person who had lived through struggles and triumphs, who had given his best to his family, every day without asking for anything in return. The dancing resumed, and Emily found herself lost in the rhythm of the music, her body swaying to the beat with Mark. They shared a moment of peace amidst the chaos of the celebration. As they danced, Emily couldn't help but think about how this day had transformed. What had begun with tension and discomfort had ended in healing, understanding, and a deeper connection to the people she loved. As the night began to wind down, and the guests started to leave, Emily felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't expected. She had always known how much her father meant to her, but tonight, she had witnessed how much he meant to everyone else as well. John had shown them all that strength came in many forms, that love and respect were not earned by age or appearance, but by the character of a person. And for Emily, that was the greatest gift of all. She knew that this wedding day, filled with love and new beginnings, would be remembered not just for the vows exchanged, but for the quiet strength of her father, who had taught everyone in the room a lesson in humility and grace. The evening was slowly winding down, and the last of the guests were beginning to say their goodbyes. The lights in the reception hall dimmed slightly as the music played softer tunes, signaling the end of a night full of celebration. Emily stood at the doorway with Mark, both of them surrounded by their closest friends and family who had come together to share this special day. The love in the room was palpable, but Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the way the day had unfolded. As guests made their way out, Emily found herself standing beside her father once more. John was leaning against the back wall, his eyes soft and content. For the first time that day, there was a sense of peace around him. He looked relaxed, almost as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Emily had always admired his ability to remain calm in the face of adversity, but today she saw something new, a quiet strength that wasn't just about enduring, but about embracing the love around him. Her heart swelled with emotion as she walked over to him. She hadn't been able to spend as much time with him during the reception as she'd wanted, and now, with the evening coming to a close, she felt the need to be close to him again. He turned to her as she approached, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. Emily could see that he was still wearing the necklace she had given him earlier, the delicate chain glinting softly under the dimmed lights. It had become more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything he had done for her, of the quiet sacrifices he had made over the years. "I'm proud of you," Emily said, her voice full of emotion. John looked down at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made Emily's heart ache. "I'm proud of you too," he said simply. His words were always few, but they carried so much weight. They stood together in silence for a moment, the noise of the evening fading into the background. Emily realized that she hadn't just married Mark today. She had also made a silent promise to herself, to always cherish and honor the relationship she had with her father. They had both come a long way, and although their journey had been filled with its share of struggles, it was also full of love and resilience. As they stood there, a figure approached from the crowd. It was Karen, the groom's mother, who had just hours before made those hurtful comments about John. Emily watched as Karen hesitated for a moment before walking up to them. She was dressed in a soft, flowing gown, and her eyes were filled with something Emily hadn't expected: sincerity. "John," Karen said quietly, her voice softer than it had been earlier in the evening, "I owe you an apology." John looked at her, his expression calm but knowing. Emily could see the way Karen was wrestling with her words. The evening had shifted so much, and Karen seemed to be struggling with the change in her own perception of John. "I never should have made those comments," Karen continued, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I misjudged you. I see now how much Emily means to you, and how much you've done for her. I didn't understand before, but I do now." John nodded gently, his eyes never leaving Karen's. "There's no need for an apology," he said quietly. "We all have our own perspectives, but it's never too late to see things differently." The words seemed to resonate with Karen. She stood there for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of John's response, before offering a small but meaningful smile. "Thank you for being so understanding," she said. The moment was short but powerful. Emily felt a shift in the air, something palpable in the way Karen had spoken to her father. It wasn't just an apology. It was a moment of growth, of acknowledgement, and of understanding. Emily realized that this was the first time Karen had truly seen John for who he was, not just the elderly man who had seemed out of place in their world, but a father who had raised a daughter with strength and grace. As Karen walked away, Emily felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She had always hoped that her father would be treated with the respect he deserved, but she had never imagined that it would come from such a place of humility. It was a moment she would never forget, a moment that changed everything. With the last of the guests gone, Emily and Mark walked hand in hand out into the cool night air. The world outside was quiet, and the stars above seemed to shine brighter than ever before. Emily leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of contentment. The day had come to an end, but the emotions from the wedding still lingered in the air. As Emily and Mark stood at the threshold of their new life together, they both felt the weight of the day's events. For Emily, it wasn't just about saying, "I do" to the man she loved. It was about family, respect, and understanding, and those lessons had been deeply etched into her heart. The sun had long set, and the stars now twinkled brightly overhead as Emily and Mark stepped into the quiet night. The world outside felt peaceful and serene, the only sounds being the distant chirps of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a far cry from the excitement and activity of the day, but for Emily, the calmness was a perfect reflection of how she felt in that moment. She was ready for the next chapter, not just with Mark, but also with her family, and especially with her father. The drive back to their new home was filled with silence, but it was a comfortable kind of silence. Emily had been processing everything that had happened, and Mark, sensing her thoughts, reached over to take her hand. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, offering the silent support she needed. "How are you feeling?" Mark asked softly, glancing at her as he drove. Emily smiled, her heart full. "I'm okay. I think I'm just processing everything. I never expected the day to unfold the way it did, but I'm glad it did." Mark nodded, his eyes focusing on the road. "I saw what you did for your father today. It was really something special." Emily's chest tightened as she remembered the moment when she had given her father the necklace. She thought of how the whole room had quieted, how Karen and Gerald had shifted in their seats, their views of her father changing in that single moment. "I just wanted him to know how much he means to me," she said, her voice a little shaky. "He's always been there for me, always given everything he has, and sometimes I don't think I show him enough appreciation for that." Mark looked at her with a tender smile. "He knows. You showed him today, in front of everyone. That's something he'll carry with him forever." The words comforted Emily more than Mark could have realized. It had been a day of so many emotions, and while there had been moments of tension and discomfort, the respect she had shown her father had brought them all closer. It was a turning point for her family, and she could feel it. When they arrived home, Emily's heart lifted at the sight of their new house. It was a modest home, but it felt perfect for the two of them, a symbol of their fresh start together. As they stepped inside, Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with love. "Are you ready to start this new adventure?" Emily nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "I am. With you by my side, I'm ready for anything." They walked into the living room, where they had already started unpacking a few boxes, and Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was their home now. This was where they would build their future. But more than that, she knew that this was the place where her father's lessons would always remain with her. The love he had shown her and the lessons of grace, respect, and forgiveness would guide her in her marriage and beyond. As she stood in the quiet of their new home, Emily realized that the wedding day had been about much more than the ceremony. It had been about understanding, about seeing each other clearly and without judgment. It had been about family, love, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing what truly matters. She walked over to the window and looked out at the night sky, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. She thought of her father, still wearing the necklace she had given him, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with love, understanding, and the strength that comes from being true to one another. The future was unwritten, but Emily felt more ready than ever to embrace it. With Mark by her side, and the love and wisdom of her father guiding her, she knew they were ready to face whatever life had in store.